The auction block at Millerville's livestock yard had seen better days, much like everything else in the drought-stricken valley. Dust devils spun lazy circles between the wooden pens, while a handful of ranchers gathered under the meager shade of a canvas awning, their faces etched with the kind of wariness that comes from watching the land turn against you. Sam's own spread, the Double M Ranch, was hanging on by a thread thinner than telegraph wire. He'd come to the auction not to buy, but to sell. His last breeding bull, a magnificent Hereford named Thunder that had sired half the quality cattle in the county. The decision had kept him awake for weeks, but with his wells running dry and his credit exhausted at the feed store, he had no choice left. "Lot 17, called out Jeremiah Hobbs, the auctioneer whose voice had grown hoarse from years of calling bids. "Bay mare, approximately 15 years old. She's seen better days, gentlemen, but she's still got spirit." Sam looked up from his private misery to see a horse being led into the ring that made his heart clench with sympathy. The mare was a skeleton draped in hide, her ribs showing like the staves of a barrel. Her coat, once a rich chestnut, had faded to the color of dried leaves. Her head hung low, and each step seemed to require tremendous effort. Most telling of all, her eyes held that distant look Sam had seen in dying cattle, a resignation that spoke of giving up the fight. "Who'll start the bidding at $20? Hobbs called out, though his tone suggested he knew he was being optimistic. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few men spat into the dust. Someone muttered something about the glue factory, and others nodded grimly. Sam felt his jaw tighten. He'd always held that there was something sacred about the bond between a man and his horse, and seeing this once proud animal reduced to a joke at an auction didn't sit right with him. $10, Hobbs tried again, his voice dropping with disappointment. Still no takers. The mare lifted her head slightly, as if sensing the mood of the crowd, and Sam could swear he saw a flicker of the pride she'd once carried. In that moment, something in the animal's bearing reminded him of his own situation. Both of them were considered finished, used up, ready for the boneyard. $5, Sam heard himself call out, though he hadn't consciously decided to speak. Every head in the small crowd turned toward him. A few men chuckled, thinking it was some kind of joke. Ben Morrison, who owned the neighboring Box M spread, shook his head and grinned. "Sam, that mare's got maybe a week left in her, if she's lucky," Morrison said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'd be throwing good money after bad." $5, Hobbs repeated, looking directly at Sam. "Do I have 5.5? 6? The silence stretched long enough for a tumbleweed to roll completely across the auction yard. Finally, Hobbs raised his gavel. "Sold to Samuel McKenna for $5. Sir, you can settle up with Martha at the office." As Sam walked toward the office to complete his purchase, he caught snatches of conversation that followed him like shadows. Poor old Sam's finally lost his mind. Throwing money away on a walking corpse. Should have put her down instead of bringing her to auction. Martha Hendricks, Hobbs' wife and bookkeeper, looked at Sam with genuine concern as he counted out $5 silver onto her desk. She was a kind woman in her 60s who had known Sam since he was a boy riding behind his father to these same auctions. "Sam, honey, what are you planning to do with that poor creature?" she asked gently. "She's suffering something fierce." Sam picked up his hat from Martha's desk and settled it carefully on his graying head. "Maybe give her a decent place to die," he said simply. "Every living thing deserves that much." Martha's eyes softened, and she patted his weathered hand. "You always were too good-hearted for your own sake, Sam McKenna." Outside, Sam found the mare tied to a hitching post, her head once again hanging low. Up close, her condition was even more heartbreaking. Her hip bones jutted out like mountain peaks, and her mane was patchy and dull. But when Sam approached and spoke softly to her, she raised her head and looked directly at him with eyes that, despite everything, still held intelligence. "Well, girl," Sam said quietly, running a gentle hand along her neck, "looks like we're both down to our last chances." The mare nickered softly, barely more than a whisper of sound, but Sam took it as acknowledgement. He fashioned a simple rope halter from the lead rope and began the slow walk home, matching his pace to the mare's labored steps. The Double M Ranch sat in a valley that had once been considered prime grazing land. Sam's grandfather had homesteaded the spread in 1867, and 3 generations of McKennas had worked to build it into something worthy of pride. The main house was sturdy and well-built, constructed of local stone and timber that had weathered decades of harsh winters and blazing summers. The barn and outbuildings showed the same careful craftsmanship, though they were beginning to show signs of deferred maintenance that spoke to Sam's current financial straits. What broke Sam's heart most was the sight of his pastures. Where his grandfather had described grass so thick it looked like a green ocean in the wind, now there was only stubbled earth and scattered patches of drought-resistant weeds. The creek that had given the ranch its original name, Twin Creek Ranch, was now nothing more than a series of disconnected pools that grew smaller each day. Sam led the mare into the barn, where she immediately moved toward the water trough. He watched with growing concern as she drank deeply, then lifted her head and looked at him with what seemed like gratitude. In the dim light of the barn, away from the harsh judgment of the auction crowd, Sam could see hints of what she might have been in her prime. The elegant arch of her neck, the intelligent set of her ears, the way she carried herself despite her obvious weakness. "What should I call you, girl?" Sam asked, spreading fresh hay in an empty stall. The mare moved into the stall and immediately began eating with an appetite that surprised him. "You've got spirit yet, don't you?" As if in response, the mare lifted her head and whinnied, a sound stronger than anything Sam had heard from her so far. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. Despite her obvious poor health, there was something about the way she held her head when she called out, something that suggested she was trying to communicate more than simple contentment. "Patience," Sam said suddenly. "That's what I'll call you. Because that's what we both need right now, patience to see what tomorrow brings." Over the next 3 days, Sam devoted most of his attention to nursing Patience back from the brink. He fed her small portions of grain every few hours, reasoning that her shrunken stomach couldn't handle large meals. He applied salve to the worst of her sores and spent hours each evening brushing her coat and talking to her in the quiet voice he'd once used with his own children before consumption had taken them and their mother 15 years ago. To his amazement, Patience began to respond. Her eyes grew brighter, and she started moving around her stall with something approaching energy. Most remarkably, she had developed a habit that both puzzled and intrigued Sam. Several times each day, she would position herself at the front of her stall and whinny in a specific direction, always toward the northeast, toward a section of his property that had been unproductive for as long as he could remember. On the 4th morning after bringing Patience home, Sam made a decision that he would later recognize as the turning point of his fortunes. The mare had been restless all night, calling out repeatedly in that same northeastern direction. When Sam came to feed her at dawn, she refused her grain, the first time since he'd brought her home that she'd shown no interest in food. Instead, she pressed against the stall door and whinnied urgently, her whole body tense with what seemed like purpose. When Sam opened the stall door to check on her, Patience immediately pushed past him and headed for the barn door, moving with more energy than he'd seen from her yet. "Easy, girl," Sam called, but Patience was already outside, standing in the yard with her head raised and her ears cricked forward. She looked back at Sam, whinnied once more, and then began walking purposefully toward the northeast corner of his property. Sam had no choice but to follow. As they moved across the drought-stricken land, he found himself thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. A week ago, he'd been a failing rancher about to lose everything he'd inherited from 3 generations of hard-working McKennas. Now he was following a half-dead horse across his own land like some kind of pilgrim seeking salvation. Patience moved with increasing urgency as they approached an area Sam rarely visited. It was a section of his property that had always been considered wasteland, rocky, uneven ground that couldn't support grass even in good years. His grandfather had used it mainly for gathering firewood, and Sam had never found any practical use for it. But as they crested a small rise, Patience suddenly stopped and began pawing at the ground with her front hoof. She whinnied loudly, then looked back at Sam as if to make sure he was watching. The morning sun was climbing higher, and Sam could see dust rising from where the mare's hoof struck the earth. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. But Patience heard it too, and her ears swiveled forward with unmistakable recognition. It was the sound of water moving underground, barely audible but definitely there. Sam knelt beside where Patience was pawing and pressed his ear to the ground. The sound was clearer now, the unmistakable murmur of an underground stream flowing somewhere beneath the rocky surface of what he'd always considered the most worthless part of his land. He looked up at Patience in wonder, and she nickered softly, as if to say, "I told you so." The discovery of water beneath his land should have filled Sam with immediate hope, but as he knelt in the dust listening to the underground stream, practical concerns crowded his mind. Even if there truly was a significant water source below, he lacked the money to hire professional well diggers. His credit was exhausted, and the $5 he'd spent on Patience represented the last of his readily available cash. Still, as he walked back to the house with the mare following closely behind, Sam found his step lighter than it had been in months. Patience seemed different too. Her head was high, and she moved with a purpose that belied her recent proximity to death. When they reached the barn, she went directly to her stall, but remained standing at the door, as if ready to lead him out again at a moment's notice. Sam spent the rest of the morning poring over his grandfather's old journals and property maps, looking for any mention of water in that section of land. What he found was intriguing. His grandfather, Ezra McKenna, had made several references to the singing rocks in the northeast quarter, noting that he'd sometimes heard strange sounds from that area during quiet mornings. More telling, there were sketches of rock formations that matched what Sam remembered seeing near where Patience had stopped. By afternoon, Sam had made a decision that his more cautious neighbors would have called foolhardy. He gathered every digging tool he owned, shovels, pickaxes, even an old crowbar, and loaded them into his wagon. If there was water down there, he was going to find it himself, even if it meant digging to China. Patience watched his preparations with what Sam could swear was approval. When he hitched up his remaining draft horse, a sturdy gelding named Buck, the mare positioned herself beside the wagon as if intending to come along. Sam had planned to leave her in the barn, but something in her manner convinced him that she had more to contribute to this enterprise. The three of them made their way back to the site where Patience had made her discovery. In the clear afternoon light, Sam could see that the ground here was different from the surrounding area. While most of his land consisted of hard-packed earth over clay, this section showed signs of different geology. More rock, but also subtle depressions that might indicate underground water movement. Sam began digging where Patience had pawed the ground and immediately ran into difficulties. The earth was harder than he'd expected, full of rocks that ranged from pebble size to chunks that required the crowbar to break free. After 2 hours of back-breaking work, he'd managed to excavate a hole barely 3 feet deep and twice as wide. But as the afternoon wore on, the soil at the bottom of his excavation began to show signs of moisture. What had started as dry, dusty earth gradually became damp, then muddy. The sound of underground water, barely audible at surface level, grew more distinct as Sam dug deeper. Patience remained nearby throughout his work, occasionally moving to different spots around the area and pawing the ground. At first, Sam thought she was simply restless, but he gradually realized that she was indicating other potential digging sites. Each spot she marked showed the same geological characteristics as his original hole. By evening, exhaustion had forced Sam to call a halt to his digging. His hands were blistered despite his work gloves, and his back ached in ways that reminded him he was no longer a young man. But the hole now showed definite signs of groundwater seepage, and his optimism was tempered only by the knowledge that seepage and a reliable well were two very different things. That night, Sam slept more soundly than he had in months, despite his physical discomfort. He woke before dawn to the sound of Patience whinnying urgently from the barn. When he went to check on her, he found her stall empty and the barn door standing open. Sam's first thought was that she had wandered off to die, as animals sometimes did when they sensed their time approaching. But as he stepped outside, he could hear her calling from the direction of his digging site. The eastern sky was just beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn as Sam made his way across the uneven ground toward the sound of her voice. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Patience was standing beside his excavation, but the hole had changed dramatically overnight. What had been a modest depression the evening before was now a crater nearly 6 feet deep and filled with crystal-clear water. The underground stream he'd been hearing had apparently found his artificial opening and chosen to reveal itself in spectacular fashion. But that wasn't the most remarkable discovery. As Sam knelt beside the spontaneous well, he could see that the water was moving, not just seeping, but flowing with enough current to create small eddies and ripples. This wasn't just groundwater. It was a genuine underground river that had been flowing beneath his land all along, waiting for someone to provide it with an outlet to the surface. Sam cupped his hands and tasted the water. It was clean and cold, with the sweet taste that spoke of a source far removed from the alkali deposits that plagued many wells in the region. As he drank deeply, Patience moved closer and lowered her head to drink beside him. In the growing morning light, Sam could see that the mare's condition had continued to improve dramatically. Her ribs were no longer quite so prominent, her coat showed hints of its former luster, and her eyes held an alertness that bordered on intelligence. "You knew, didn't you, girl?" Sam said quietly. "Somehow you knew this water was here." Patience lifted her dripping muzzle from the water and nickered softly, a sound that Sam interpreted as confirmation. As they stood together beside the miraculous well, Sam began to formulate plans that would have seemed like impossible dreams just a week earlier. With this water source, he could not only save his ranch, but potentially expand it. Grass would grow again in his pastures. His cattle could thrive instead of merely surviving. He might even be able to buy back Thunder, his prize bull, if the new owner hadn't already moved him too far away. But as Sam's excitement grew, he became aware of another sound that sent a chill through his optimism. Hoofbeats were approaching from the direction of the main road, multiple riders moving at a purposeful pace that suggested this wasn't a social call. Sam counted 6 riders as they crested the ridge that separated his property from the county road. Even at a distance, he recognized the lead rider's distinctive silhouette. Benjamin Morrison, his neighbor and longtime rival, sat his horse with the arrogant posture of a man accustomed to getting his way. The men with him were strangers to Sam, but their dress and bearing suggested they weren't local ranchers. As the group approached, Sam could make out more details that increased his unease. Morrison was dressed more formally than Sam had ever seen him, wearing a black suit that looked like it had come from San Francisco rather than the local general store. The strangers with him were similarly well dressed, and Sam caught the glint of surveying equipment among their gear. Patience seemed to sense the threat these men represented. She moved closer to Sam and stood with her head high and her ears pinned back, a posture Sam recognized as defensive. The mare might have been near death a week ago, but she clearly retained the instincts to recognize potential enemies. "Morning, Sam," Morrison called out as the group reined in near the new well. His tone was carefully neutral, but Sam could detect an undercurrent of satisfaction that made his stomach tighten with apprehension. "Ben," Sam replied, equally neutral, "you're up early, and you brought company." "Business, Sam." These gentlemen are from the Consolidated Land Company out of Denver. They're interested in acquiring property in this area for a development project. One of the strangers, a thin man with steel-gray hair and calculating eyes, urged his horse forward. "Mr. McKenna, I presume? I'm James Whitmore, representing Consolidated. We understand you've been experiencing some financial difficulties." Sam felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "My finances are my own concern, Mr. Whitmore." "Of course," Whitmore agreed smoothly, "but we're prepared to make you a generous offer for your property. Enough to pay off all your debts and leave you with a comfortable sum to start fresh somewhere else." "I'm not interested in selling." Morrison laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Sam, be reasonable. You can't run cattle without water, and there's no water left in this valley. Take their offer while it's still on the table." Sam gestured toward the well beside him. "I've got all the water I need right here." The change in Morrison's expression was immediate and telling. The satisfied smile disappeared, replaced by something much harder and more calculating. Whitmore and his companions exchanged glances that confirmed Sam's growing suspicion that this visit wasn't as coincidental as it had been presented. "That's quite a hole you've dug, Sam," Morrison said carefully. "But seepage and a reliable water source are two different things. You can't build a ranch's future on a mud puddle." Before Sam could respond, Patience moved. The mare stepped between Sam and the mounted men, and something in her posture triggered an almost electric tension in the air. The visitors' horses began to shift nervously, picking up on signals that their riders couldn't detect, but that spoke to deeper animal instincts. Whitmore's horse actually took several steps backward, despite his attempts to control it. "Interesting animal," he said, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining his composed demeanor. "Looks like she's seen better days." "She's seen enough to know trouble when it shows up uninvited," Sam replied, his meaning clear. The confrontation might have escalated further, but Patience suddenly raised her head and called out with a sound unlike anything Sam had heard from her before. It was louder than her usual whinny, with an almost musical quality that seemed to carry much farther than should have been possible. Within moments, Sam heard answering calls from multiple directions. To his amazement, horses began appearing from various points around his property. Some he recognized as his own animals that had been grazing in distant pastures, but others were clearly wild horses that had come down from the hills. They approached cautiously, but with obvious purpose, forming a loose circle around the well and the humans gathered there. The visitors' horses became increasingly agitated as the wild horses gathered. Morrison's mount began to prance and toss its head, and one of Whitmore's companions had to fight to keep his horse from bolting entirely. "What the hell is going on here?" Morrison demanded, his careful composure finally cracking. Sam didn't have an answer, but he was beginning to understand that Patience was far more than the dying horse he'd purchased at auction. Whatever was happening, she was orchestrating it with an intelligence that defied everything Sam thought he knew about horses. As the standoff continued, with more wild horses still arriving from the surrounding hills, Sam realized that his simple act of kindness in buying a dying horse had set in motion events that would determine not just his own future, but the future of everyone in the valley. The water beneath his land was clearly more significant than even he had realized, and the men facing him were prepared to go to considerable lengths to claim it for themselves. Patience nickered softly and moved closer to Sam, as if to reassure him that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. The gathering of wild horses around Sam's property created an atmosphere charged with primitive tension. Whitmore and his companions had managed to regain control of their mounts, but the animals remained skittish and difficult to manage. Morrison's horse was lathered with sweat despite the cool morning air, and its rider's knuckles were white where he gripped the reins. Sam counted at least 20 horses in the loose circle that had formed around the well, ranging from a magnificent paint stallion that commanded obvious respect from the others, to several mares with foals that stayed close to their mothers. All of them seemed to be looking to Patience for direction, and the old mare stood with the regal bearing of a queen addressing her court. "This is getting ridiculous," Morrison said, his voice tight with frustration. "Sam, call off your horse circus and let's discuss business like civilized men." "I'm not controlling anything here, Ben," Sam replied truthfully, "but I'm starting to think that maybe we should talk about what's really going on. Why is the Consolidated Land Company so interested in a drought-stricken ranch that supposedly has no water?" Whitmore had been studying the well with calculating eyes, and Sam noticed that the man had quietly taken several photographs with a small camera while attention was focused on the horses. "Mr. McKenna, you're obviously a practical man. Surely you realize that one small water source isn't going to solve the problems facing this entire region." "Maybe not," Sam agreed, "but it's a start. And it makes me wonder what other water sources might be around here that haven't been discovered yet." The look that passed between Whitmore and Morrison confirmed Sam's growing suspicions. These men knew more about the water situation in the valley than they were admitting, and their presence here was no coincidence. Patience suddenly moved away from Sam and began walking slowly around the perimeter of the gathered horses. To Sam's amazement, she seemed to be inspecting them individually, occasionally touching noses with certain animals and making soft sounds that seemed to carry specific meaning. The paint stallion approached her with obvious deference, and after a brief exchange of whispered horse conversation, he moved to a position that clearly established him as her lieutenant. "I've never seen anything like this," one of Whitmore's companions said quietly. "It's like she's organizing them." "Horses don't organize," Morrison snapped. "They're animals, not soldiers." But even as he spoke, the truth of what was happening became undeniable. Under Patience's direction, the wild horses began to spread out across Sam's property in what could only be described as a search pattern. Groups of 3 or 4 animals moved to different sections of the land where they would stop, mill around briefly, and then either move on or begin pawing at the ground in the same manner Patience had used to locate the first well. Within an hour, the horses had identified 6 additional sites where their behavior suggested the presence of underground water. Sam watched in amazement as nature provided him with a geological survey more thorough than anything Whitmore's company could have produced with their expensive equipment. "This is impossible," Whitmore muttered, but his camera was busy documenting everything the horses discovered. Sam was beginning to understand the true scope of what lay beneath his land. This wasn't just a single underground stream, but apparently an entire network of interconnected waterways that had been flowing unseen beneath the valley for centuries. The drought had lowered the water table enough to hide the resource from conventional detection, but somehow Patience had retained the ancient knowledge that allowed her to locate it. As this realization dawned on him, Sam also began to understand why Morrison and the land company were so eager to acquire his property. In a region facing severe water shortages, control of such an extensive underground water system would be worth a fortune. But the implications went far beyond simple monetary value. With this water, the entire character of the valley could be transformed. What was now marginal grazing land could become prime agricultural property. Towns could expand and prosper instead of slowly dying as their wells failed. "All right," Sam said finally, his voice carrying new authority. "I think it's time for some straight talk. Mr. Whitmore, how long has your company known about the water under my land?" Whitmore's hesitation was answer enough, but Morrison decided to fill the silence with bluster. "Sam, you're letting your imagination run away with you. These men are offering you a fair price for worthless land. Don't be too greedy to recognize a good deal." "Worthless land?" Sam gestured toward the horses, who had now located what appeared to be at least a dozen potential well sites. "Ben, that water system extends under both our properties. In fact, I'm betting it extends under most of the valley. The question is, who else knows about it?" The paint stallion chose that moment to approach the group of mounted men directly. Unlike their earlier skittish behavior, the visitors' horses now stood calmly as the wild stallion moved among them. But instead of showing aggression, the stallion seemed to be examining each horse and rider with intelligent curiosity. When he reached Morrison's mount, something changed. The stallion's ears went back, and he let out a sound that was unmistakably a warning. Morrison's horse responded by shying away so violently that its rider nearly lost his seat. "What's wrong with your animal?" Whitmore demanded. But Sam was watching Patience, and he saw recognition in her eyes as she looked at Morrison. The mare approached Morrison's horse and made the same soft sounds Sam had heard her use when communicating with the other horses. Morrison's mount responded by nickering, in a way that sounded almost like conversation. "He'll be damned," Sam said softly. "You know her, don't you, Ben? Patience isn't just any horse. She's one of yours." Morrison's face went through a series of expressions before settling on resignation mixed with anger. "She was my best cutting horse 15 years ago. Won competitions all over the territory. But then she got old, and I couldn't afford to keep feeding an animal that wasn't earning her keep. So you sold her?" "Sold her to a fellow who promised to give her a good retirement. But times got hard for him, too, and she ended up changing hands several more times. I heard she died years ago." Sam looked at Patience with new understanding. "But she didn't die. She just kept getting passed around until she ended up at that auction, half-starved and looking like death warmed over. And somehow she remembered this valley. She remembered where the water was." "Horses don't remember things like that," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "This one does," Sam said firmly, "and I'm betting she remembers a lot more than just where to find water. She remembers who treated her well and who didn't. She remembers who can be trusted and who can't." As if to emphasize his point, Patience moved to stand beside Sam while continuing to regard Morrison with what could only be described as reproach. The message was clear. She had chosen her side in whatever conflict was developing. Whitmore had been following this exchange with growing agitation. "Gentlemen, we're getting distracted by sentiment. Mr. McKenna, our offer stands, but it won't remain on the table indefinitely. Market conditions are changing, and opportunities like this don't wait for romantic notions about horses." "What market conditions?" Sam asked. "What aren't you telling me?" Before Whitmore could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the confrontation. Sam looked toward his main road and saw a convoy of official-looking automobiles kicking up dust as they approached his property. The lead vehicle bore the seal of the territorial government, and Sam's heart sank as his simple discovery of water had attracted attention at the highest levels. But as the convoy drew closer, Sam noticed something that gave him hope. The second vehicle in the procession bore the markings of the Territorial Water Commission, and he recognized the driver as Tom Brennan, a man he'd known since childhood who had made a career of fighting for the rights of small ranchers against larger interests. Patience seemed to sense the changing dynamics as well. She raised her head and called out in that same musical voice she'd used earlier, and the wild horses began to reposition themselves. Instead of the loose circle they'd maintained around the well, they now formed what looked distinctly like a defensive formation, with the strongest animals positioned between the new arrivals and the water source. "Looks like word travels fast in the territory," Sam observed. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm guessing your company's interest in my land isn't quite as exclusive as you led me to believe." Whitmore's careful composure was beginning to crack. "Mr. McKenna, I strongly advise you to accept our offer before this situation becomes complicated." "It's already complicated," Sam replied, "but maybe it's time to let some other folks weigh in on just how complicated it should get." As the government vehicles came to a halt near the well, Sam found himself at the center of what was clearly going to be a much larger conflict than his personal struggle to save his ranch. But with Patience standing steadily beside him and an army of wild horses arrayed around his property, he felt more confident than he had in years that he might finally have allies worthy of the fight ahead. The first man to emerge from the lead vehicle was tall and silver-haired, wearing the uniform of a territorial official. But it was Tom Brennan who approached Sam directly, his weathered face showing the kind of excitement that suggested this discovery was even more significant than Sam had realized. "Sam McKenna," Brennan said, extending his hand, "I've been hoping for 20 years that something like this would turn up. That water system you found doesn't just run under your property. According to our preliminary surveys, it extends under most of the valley and connects to aquifers that reach all the way to the mountain snowpack. You found the key to saving every ranch and farm in the region." Whitmore stepped forward aggressively. "Now see here, Mr. Brennan. Consolidated Land Company has a legitimate business interest in this property. We've made Mr. McKenna a fair offer, and any water rights would naturally transfer with the sale." "That's where you're wrong," Brennan replied calmly. "Under territorial water law, naturally occurring water sources belong to the people of the territory, not to private companies. And based on what I'm seeing here, this isn't just a private water source. This is a public resource that's been hidden until now." Sam felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying begin to lift from his shoulders. "Tom, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that your discovery of this water system makes you eligible for territorial protection and support. Instead of losing your ranch, you're likely to become the caretaker of one of the most important water resources in the territory. There'll be compensation, Sam, enough to not only save your ranch, but to make it more prosperous than it's ever been." Morrison's face had gone pale. "What about the rest of us? My ranch is right next to Sam's. If there's water under his land, there's probably water under mine too." "There's only one way to find out," Brennan said. "But first, we need to secure this site and make sure no one tries to interfere with a proper survey." As if she understood the conversation, Patience moved to the edge of the well and lowered her head to drink. The other horses followed her example, and soon the entire herd was drinking from the clear, cold water that had transformed Sam's fortune. In that moment, Sam realized that his $5 purchase of a dying horse had not only saved Patience's life, it had saved his own life and the lives of everyone in the valley. Over the following months, as territorial surveyors confirmed the extent of the underground water system, and engineers began the process of developing it for the benefit of the entire region, Sam often found himself standing by the original well with Patience at his side. The mare had made a complete recovery, her coat now glossy chestnut, and her eyes bright with the intelligence that had never really dimmed, even in her darkest hours. The wild horses had gradually returned to the hills, but they often came to drink at Sam's well, and Patience always greeted them as old friends. Morrison had swallowed his pride and asked Sam to help locate water on his property, which Patience had done with the same uncanny accuracy she'd shown on Sam's land. The Consolidated Land Company had quietly withdrawn their interest when it became clear that the water resources would be developed under territorial oversight rather than private ownership. But perhaps the most satisfying change was the return of Thunder, Sam's prize bull, which he'd been able to buy back when his compensation from the territorial government had made him financially secure for the first time in years. Thunder had taken one look at Patience and seemed to recognize that she was responsible for the ranch's transformation. The two animals had become fast friends, often standing together in the shade of the barn during the heat of the day. As Sam watched his pastures turn green again with the reliable irrigation the well system provided, he often thought about the chain of events that had led to this transformation. It had all started with an act of simple compassion, seeing a dying horse at an auction and being unable to walk away. But that single moment of kindness had revealed resources and relationships that had always existed, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize their value. "You knew all along, didn't you, girl?" Sam would say to Patience as they surveyed the thriving ranch that had once seemed doomed to failure. and Patience would nick her softly and nuzzle his shoulder, as if to say that some knowledge is worth waiting a lifetime to share with the right person. The Double M Ranch became legendary throughout the territory, not just for its prosperity, but for the story of the dying horse who had led her rescuer to salvation. Visitors came from hundreds of miles away to see Patience and to drink from the well that had started it all. But Sam was careful to limit such visits, understanding that both Patience and the water source deserved respect and protection. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting behind the western hills, Sam would often sit on his porch with a cup of coffee and watch Patience grazing in the home pasture. The mare moved with the dignity of an animal who knew her worth, no longer the broken creature he'd found at the auction, but a living testament to the power of second chances. Sometimes Tom Brennan would stop by to check on the well system's development, and the two men would discuss the broader implications of the discovery. The territorial government had used Sam's find as the foundation for a comprehensive water management program that was transforming the entire region. Towns that had been withering were now planning expansion. Ranchers who had been selling out were investing in new stock and equipment. "You know, Sam," Brennan said during one such visit, "economists from back east are calling this the most significant resource discovery in the territory. They're saying it could support a population 10 times what we have now." Sam nodded, but his attention was focused on Patience, who had approached the fence and was regarding the two men with her intelligent gaze. "Maybe so, Tom, but I keep thinking about something my grandfather used to say, that the land will provide what you need when you need it if you're wise enough to recognize the gift when it comes." "You think that old horse was a gift?" "I think she was exactly what she appeared to be, a dying animal that needed help. But I also think that sometimes, when you do the right thing for its own sake, you discover that the right thing was also the smart thing. I didn't buy Patience because I thought she'd make me rich. I bought her because leaving her to die felt wrong." Brennan was quiet for a moment, watching as Patience moved closer to the fence. The mare extended her head toward Sam, who reached out to stroke her neck with the same gentle touch had used that first day in the barn. "She's still trying to tell you something," Brennan observed. Sam looked at his friend with surprise. "What makes you say that?" "The way she looks at you, like she's got more secrets to share if you're ready to listen." As if responding to Brennan's words, Patience lifted her head and called out in that distinctive musical voice that had first summoned the wild horses. But this time, the sound was different, softer, more intimate, as if she were sharing a confidence meant only for Sam's ears. In the distance, Sam could hear an answering call, but it wasn't from horses. It was the sound of water moving underground, the same subtle murmur had first heard when Patience had led him to dig the original well. But now, with his ear trained to recognize it, Sam could hear that the sound was coming from multiple directions, a symphony of hidden streams that spoke of resources yet to be discovered. "She's not done yet, is she?" Sam said quietly. Patience nickered softly and moved along the fence line toward the gate, her manner suggesting that she was ready for another journey of discovery. Sam looked at Brennan, who was already reaching for his surveying equipment with the enthusiasm of a man who had learned to trust in miracles. "Well, Tom," Sam said, opening the gate to let Patience out, "looks like we're about to find out just how deep this gift goes." As the three of them set off across the ranch in the golden light of evening, man, horse, and the territorial official who had become the chronicler of their discoveries, Sam reflected on the strange turns that life could take. A year ago, he had been a failed rancher buying a dying horse out of pity. Now, he was the guardian of resources that would shape the future of the entire territory. But the most remarkable transformation was in Patience herself. No longer the broken animal from the auction, she moved with the confidence of a creature who had found her purpose. As she led them toward whatever new discovery awaited, Sam understood that her true gift hadn't been her ability to find water. It had been her capacity to recognize in him someone worthy of trust. Behind them, the lights of the ranch house glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, and the sound of water flowing freely through the irrigation channels created a gentle music that spoke of abundance where there had once been only drought. The Double M Ranch had been saved by the wisdom of a dying horse and the compassion of a man who had refused to let her die alone. And as they walked together into the deepening evening, Sam knew that their story was far from over. Patience had given him back his ranch, his livelihood, and his hope for the future. But more than that, she had taught him that sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as burdens, and that the act of carrying those burdens with grace can transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. The territory would remember this as the year the great aquifer was discovered, the year that changed everything. But Sam would remember it as the year he learned that $5 spent in kindness could be worth more than all the gold in California, and that sometimes the best investment a man can make is in something the world has given up for dead. As Patience led them toward her next revelation, Sam smiled and followed, knowing that whatever she had to show him would be worth the journey.